Hello BookTube. Continuing on my journey through the Three Musketeers series, I now come to the third book in the series, which I believe is pronounced the Vicomte de Bragelonne. And apologies if I mispronounce that, and apologies in advance. There are a few more French names coming up that I'm probably going to mispronounce. Just sorry about that. But anyways, this is the third book in the series, or depending on how you look at it, this is the first part of the third book, because something I mentioned in my introductory video on the Three Musketeers series is that the third book is broken up into either 3 books or 4 books or 5 books in English translation, depending on the publisher. I read these books from the Project Gutenberg website, so I'm going to be following their divisions. And I will link in the description down below to the place where on Project Gutenberg where I got this book from, if you want to follow along for yourself. But Project Gutenberg has it divided into 4 parts, and the first part is the Vicomte de Bragelonne, and I'm just going to count this as the third book in the Three Musketeers series. Does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. So there's 3 books in the Three Musketeers series, but the third book is divided into 4 parts in the English translation. So we're here right now. Okay. Anyways, a lot of the things I said before about the Three Musketeers series holds true for this book as well. But there are some differences that are appearing now. And the major difference here is the pacing. So in the first book, The Three Musketeers, the original book, the pacing was very fast. The characters were rushing from adventure to adventure, and it was a real page-turner. Here, the pacing has slowed way down in a way that feels very deliberate. For example, when the characters stop at an inn, we get a whole chapter just to describe the history of that inn. We have another whole chapter just devoted to describing the political background in England. Now, this isn't all bad once you get used to it, and you know how it is. If you're in the mood for a book that moves fast, then you go with a book that moves fast. And if you have a book that moves slow, you just need to get yourself in the mood for that pacing. And once you make that adjustment, it is kind of nice to just slow down and soak in all the details. But it's a change. I don't know why Alexandre Dumas made that pacing change here in the third book. If I was cynical, I would suspect he was milking it for money. This book, like the previous 2 books, was originally serialized, and I believe he got paid by the installment. So maybe that's why we have a whole chapter just devoted to the history of the inn where the characters stop in. I don't know. Another thing that's interesting about this book is that, these books have always been historical fiction, but it's been centered mostly on the Three Musketeers. And the Three Musketeers, I forgot to mention this in my first video, but the Three Musketeers are very loosely based on a few characters that Alexandre Dumas found in the historical record. So apparently there really was a D'Artagnan who was like captain of the King's Musketeers that Alexandre Dumas stumbled across. But they're, aside from having these names that correspond to the historical record, they're largely fictional creations. And the focus has been on their story, and the real historical figures have been in the background. Now, the historical figures are in the foreground, and we spend all this time with Louis XIV and with his ministers and across the English Channel with the English politicians. And the Three Musketeers have now become background figures in their own story. I mean, they're still there, but they're not moving the plot anymore. And it's the historical figures who we're focusing on now. So the book has become much more heavily historical fiction in that regard. Now, again, Alexandre Dumas is taking a lot of liberties with the history, but the real history is very much the focus of this book. Now, as with the second book, in the second book, 20 years after, I mentioned that in the French politics, we sympathize with everyone. And everyone has kind of their good points and bad points, and the complexity of the politics is allowed for. Whereas across the English Channel, we don't get that complexity. It's the good guys who are the royalists versus the bad guys who are the Republicans. Now, like most modern readers, my personal sympathies are with the Republicans. But, you just have to swallow that if you want to enjoy this book, and just, put that in the back of your mind and just go along with the story. So I'll deal with the story on the English side first, because that's, I guess, the least complex. We deal with the restoration of the monarchy, and Charles II gets restored to the English throne, which is presented as this great, glorious moment of civilization triumphing in these books. And again, just swallow your Republican sympathies as you read it. What is interesting, though, is we get a lot of attention focused on General Monk, who is a transition figure between the Protectorate under Cromwell and the Restoration under Charles II. There was this period in English history where General Monk was kind of looked to have all the power in his hand, and he could decide which way he wanted the future of England to go. In the histories I've read, Monk is usually brushed over as just this in-between figure, even though his brief period as being in control of things is kind of a fascinating little period to look at in detail. And Alexandre Dumas focuses in that in some detail. So that's interesting to read about if you're interested in this period of English history. Over on the French side, we have Louis XIV, who is the Sun King, the most powerful French monarch, or one of the most. But we meet him at this point when he's very young still, and he is trying to get out from under the tutelage of Cardinal Mazarin, who is controlling him. Cardinal Mazarin is from the previous book. Also, he is, Louis XIV is aided by Colbert, and he is trying to assert his authority and strength at the expense of the superintendent of finances, whose name is, I believe, pronounced Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet? We'll go with Fouquet. So much of the book is sympathetic to the ambitions of Louis XIV, but Dumas, however, shows equal sympathy towards Fouquet. The reader is shown everything from Fouquet's perspective as well as from Louis XIV's perspective. And as with 20 years after, the Musketeers themselves are divided again. So D'Artagnan supports Louis XIV, but Porthos and Aramis are working for Fouquet. As with the previous books, there's a fair amount of cloak and dagger intrigue, which is one of the big draws of this book. So there's this big plot with Fouquet and his circle. They're trying to save one of their friends from the hangman. There's a lot of plotting, intrigue. It's all very interesting. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this book. There's also some things I found were not quite so interesting. So one of the main characters in this book is Raoul, who is not one of the original Musketeers. He's the son of one of the original Musketeers. So his father is Athos, one of the original Musketeers. Now, I forgot to mention this in the previous video, but Raoul actually shows up in book number 2, 20 years after, where he's a major character in that book. But here in book 3, he is coming into his own right as one of the main drivers of the plot, and it looks like this next book, this next series of books, is going to be centered around Raoul. Now, the Three Musketeers were a little bit stereotypes or one-note characterizations, but they were interesting in that they were flawed. So D'Artagnan starts out, I mentioned this in the previous videos, but D'Artagnan starts out as very idealistic, and then he gradually becomes corrupted by the world. Athos has all these inner demons that are tormenting him, and he starts out the story as being very vicious and somewhat bloodthirsty. Aramis is the spiritual one, but he's also a little bit cynical in his approach to the priesthood, and Porthos is the vain one or the dumb one, etc. They all have their flaws, which makes them interesting characters. Raoul, however, is portrayed as a little bit too perfect. He's just portrayed as the perfect picture of filial devotion, which makes him a very boring character. And unfortunately, he's setting up to be the protagonist of this next series of books. So there you have it. There's some interesting stuff going on in this book, and also some boring stuff. But stick around, because next video I hope to talk about 10 Years After, which is the 4th book in the Three Musketeers series. Thank you very much, and talk to you later, BookTube.